I knew the proclamation was a lie before I had finished reading the first line of it, and I knew it because of the wax. I have been keeper of the rolls of the House of Estmere for 31 years. My whole working life has been spent with seals, pressing them, registering them, breaking them, defending them. A man who has handled 40,000 impressions of the Great Seal can tell you in the dark, by the smell of the wax and the bite of the matrix, whether a thing is true. And the seal on the document they laid before the council the morning after the old king died was the right red, the right size, and bore the right device, the tower and the 3 rivers of Estmere, and it was wrong. The wax had been warmed and pressed twice. There was a faint ghost of an earlier impression beneath the clean one, the way a word written over an erasure never quite forgets the word it covered. I did not say so. A clerk who cries forgery in a council chamber the hour the throne falls empty, with the most powerful men in the kingdom watching, had better be ready to die for it. I was not ready. Not yet. So I held the parchment a moment longer than was natural, and felt the room watching me hold it, and set it down and said nothing, and the lie went forward into the world. The lie was this. King Aldous of Estmere had died in the night, old and long failing, with no living son. The succession should have passed to his late brother's line, to a grandnephew, a quiet young man of 19 named Tobin, raised half-forgotten on a marsh estate 3 days' ride from the capital, and brought to court only that spring, blinking at the candlelight like a man who had never seen so many. But the document I held named another, Lord Hadrian Vell, a cousin of the dead king by a remoter and more tangled descent, a man of 40, smooth, handsome, much loved at the better tables, who had spent 10 patient years making himself useful to everyone who mattered. The proclamation declared that the dying king, in his last lucid hour, had set aside the marsh boy as unfit and named Lord Vell his heir, under the king's own hand and the Great Seal, witnessed and sealed. It was beautiful work. The hand was Aldous' hand, or near enough that I could not have sworn against it across a courtroom. The phrasing was the phrasing the old king used. Only the wax had betrayed it, and only to me, and I was one frightened old man with ink on his fingers and no army. What I did not yet understand, that first gray morning, was that I was not the only one who knew. There was another man in the palace who knew the truth of the succession not from wax or hand, but because he had stood in the room when the truth was made, and he had been standing at his post the whole while, 6 feet from the council door, so still and so silent that not one of the great men plotting on the far side of it had thought to count him as a person at all. His name was Sergeant Edric Marl of the KingsGuard, and before I am done, you will understand why the kingdom should remember it. Let me go back 2 years, for that is where this truly begins. 2 years before the old king died, on a winter night when the corridors were empty and the fires banked low, I was summoned to the king's private cabinet at an hour when no clerk is summoned for any honest reason. I went in fear. I found Aldous awake and clear, clearer than I had seen him in months, sitting upright with a single candle and a sealed box at his elbow, one guardsman standing inside the door. That was against every rule of the household. Guardsmen stand outside doors, not in. But the king had wanted a witness who could not be bought and could not be questioned, a man whose whole training was to see everything and say nothing, and he had chosen the sergeant on the door that night the way another man might choose a stone for its weight. Edric Marl stood with his back to the paneling, rifle grounded, eyes forward, and did not so much as glance at me when I came in. "Keeper," the old king said, "I am going to do a thing tonight, and the 2 of you are going to remember it after I am gone, because there are men in this house who would give a great deal to make it unhappen." He had me draw up the true instrument of succession in my own hand, naming the marsh boy, Tobin, plainly and without flourish, my brother's true grandson, of my blood, the heir my law makes, whatever any man may say of him hereafter. He had kept the boy hidden so long not from shame, but because he had buried 2 sons and feared a known heir was a hunted heir. He had wanted the child loved on a marsh rather than measured at a court. And he had seen, late and clearly, the patient hunger circling his cousin Vel, and meant to leave the succession nailed down so hard that no clever man could pry it loose. Then he did the thing I have never told another soul until now. He made the true instrument in duplicate. One copy he sealed and laid in the box, to be lodged where the law lodges such things. The other he did not seal in the ordinary way at all. He pressed the great seal into it, and while the wax was still soft, he pressed into the same wax a second mark. A small private signet he wore on a cord under his shirt, a thing no forger could know of because no forger had ever seen it, a worn old ring with the head of a heron that had been his own father's. 2 seals in one wax, the public and the secret, fused. A forger can steal a hand, the old king said. He can steal even the great seal, given a corrupt enough servant and a long enough night. He cannot steal a thing he does not know exists. He looked at me, and then for the first and only time that night he looked at the guardsman by the door. "Sergeant, you have seen the heron. You will be the only living man besides the keeper who has. Whatever they bring out after I am dead, if it does not carry the heron beneath the tower, it is a lie, and you will do what an honest man does with a lie." "Yes, Majesty," Edric Marl said. 2 words. It was the only thing I ever heard him say in that room. The king gave the double-sealed instrument into the sergeant's keeping that night, not into mine, and not into the law's box. "The box can be opened by men with keys," he said. "I would rather it lived for a while behind a man who cannot be opened at all." And Edric Marl put the folded parchment inside his red coat against his heart and stood his post, and I went back to my cold rooms and told no one. 2 years later the old king died. The smooth cousin's beautiful forgery came forward, and somewhere in the palace, behind a face that had never once moved, one silent man carried the truth folded against his chest and waited to be asked. The trouble was that no one was asking. Lord Vel did not seize the throne the way a soldier seizes a hill. He took it the way water takes a low field, slowly, reasonably, with everyone agreeing at each step that of course this was sensible. By the second day his proclamation had been read at the gates and copied for the provinces. By the third, the law box that should have held my true instrument was found and opened and empty, the seal unbroken, the parchment simply gone, a thing that cannot honestly happen and which everyone agreed must have happened honestly. The Lord Chancellor, a tired and decent man named Brenner who wanted only for the kingdom not to come apart, looked at the beautiful forgery and the empty box and the smiling cousin and the silent marsh boy, and made the choice tired decent men make. He chose the version of events that did not require anyone powerful to be a criminal. The coronation was set for the 8th day. Lord Hadrian Vel would be crowned King of Estmere in the great cathedral of the capital, before the assembled lords and the foreign envoys and the people. The marsh boy Tobin would be thanked for his understanding and pensionied quietly back to his fens. The lie would harden into law, and after a year, no one would remember there had ever been a question. I went to the empty law box myself, on the 4th day, on the excuse of an inventory. I knelt and looked at the seal that had supposedly never been broken. It had been lifted with a hot wire and pressed back, beautiful work again, the same patient hand, and beneath the rim a single dark thread had caught, the kind that frays from a fine glove. I folded it into a paper, and as I rose I understood 3 things at once, and all 3 frightened me. The first was that whoever had emptied this box knew exactly which document to take, which meant the plot reached into the Rolls office itself, into men I worked beside. The second was that they had taken only the law's copy, because they did not know there was a second. The third was the thread. Lord Vel's man of business, a soft-spoken steward named Carrick who went everywhere with him and was admitted everywhere with him, wore gray kid gloves of exactly that weave. I had shaken his hand 100 times. I am not a brave man. I want that on the record, because what the guardsman did is only the size it is when you stand it next to what a frightened clerk would not do. I knew the box was robbed, and by whom, near enough. I knew the man crowned in 8 days would be a forgery and a crown. And I went back to my rooms and bolted the door and sat with my hands shaking and told myself it was not my place, that the Chancellor must surely see what I saw, that one old man with a thread in a paper could not stand against a faction that already held the seal and the box and the cathedral. It was on the 5th night that I crossed the corridor to the man who had no such doubts. I had not planned it. I had gone out for air, unable to sleep, and found myself in the long gallery outside the council chamber where the door guard stands. And there he was, the same sergeant, Edric Marl, posted on the same door, 2 years older and not 1 degree less still. The household had not moved him. Why would they? He was furniture. He had stood through the old king's death and the forged proclamation and the robbed box and the whole quiet theft of a kingdom, and to the men doing the stealing he was no more than the paneling. I stopped in front of him and did not know if he would remember me, or the room, or the heron, or whether 2 years and a dead king had loosened the thing the old man had locked into him. "Sergeant," I said very low, "do you remember a winter night and a candle and a king who showed us a ring?" For a long moment he did not move at all, and I thought I had been a fool. Then, without turning his head, he answered me in the same flat 2-word manner he had used to the king. "Against my heart." I did not understand him for a moment. Then I did, and my own heart turned over. He was telling me where the document was. He still had it. 2 years, a dead master, an emptied law box, a forged proclamation read at every gate, and Edric Marl had simply gone on standing his post with the truth of the kingdom folded inside his coat, waiting for an honest man to do the honest thing with the lie, because none had yet come and asked. I almost wept in the gallery. "Then we must take it to the Chancellor," I whispered, "tonight, now, before the coronation." "No," he said. It was the first time I ever heard him refuse anything, and it stopped me cold. He still had not moved. "The box was robbed by men inside the rolls," he said, so quietly that I had to lean toward the wall as though I were a man admiring the carving. "If I hand this to the Chancellor tonight, it goes into a room with locks, and a man with a hot wire visits it before morning, and then there are 2 empty boxes instead of 1, and you and I are the only men who ever saw a second copy, and one quiet accident takes care of both of us. A thing this size is not safe in a strong room. It is only safe in the open, in front of too many eyes to silence at once." I stared at him, a door guard who could not leave his post or raise his voice or argue with a lord, and he had thought further into the dark than the Chancellor of the whole realm. "Then how?" I said. "The coronation," he said. And I understood. The one room in 8 days that would hold every lord, every envoy, every churchman, the people in the nave and the realm's whole memory watching, too many eyes to silence, too public to bury. The forgers had chosen the cathedral to harden their lie into law before the world. The silent man on the door meant to use the very same stage to break it. "You cannot speak there," I said. "You will not be allowed 3 words before they take you down. A guardsman who breaks ranks in the cathedral on the coronation day, they will call you mad or paid or both, and the document with you." "That is why it cannot be me who speaks," Edric Marl said. "And it cannot be you. They have a name ready for each of us, a clerk who lost a paper, a soldier who left his post. There is only one man in that cathedral whose word about the succession no faction can explain away." For the first time in 2 years I saw the smallest thing move in his face, not a smile, only a kind of settling, the way a man's jaw sets when he has finished deciding. It must be the heir, the true one, and before he can stand up before the world and refuse the lie to its face, somebody has to teach a frightened marsh boy how to stop being afraid. The marsh boy was kept in the west wing in good rooms, watched by good servants, all of them Lord Vels. He was not a prisoner. That was the genius of it. Tobin was free to walk the gardens, free to dine, free to do anything except be believed. He had already signed, 2 days before, a paper of gracious withdrawal the boy had been gently talked into. The way you talk a tired man into agreeing to anything if you bring him enough kind faces. They had not needed to threaten him. They had only needed him to be exactly what they had told the kingdom he was. A small, uncertain, marsh-bred boy who knew in his bones that he did not belong under a crown. I did not know how a door guard who could not leave his post would reach a boy locked away across the palace behind Vel's own servants. I should have known. The whole strength of Edric Marl was that he had spent his life being where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what his orders said, until the men who gave the orders forgot he was a man at all, and a man no one watches can go a great many places. He did not go himself. His absence from the council door would have been noticed within the hour, and noticed absence is the one thing a watcher cannot afford. So he sent me. He gave me that night in the gallery a thing to carry and a thing to say. The thing to carry was not the document that stayed against his heart, and I understood why. If I were caught, I must have nothing on me worth killing for. It was small and harmless, and to anyone who searched me, meaningless. A child's wooden soldier, old, the paint long worn off, a guardsman in a tall hat with a red coat scraped down to the grain. He did not explain it. "Give it to the boy," he said, "and tell him the man at the king's door sent it, and that it remembers the heron. Then tell him what I tell you to tell him, word for word, and not one word past it. I will not pretend I was not searched. I was twice, on my way through the West Wing, by soft-spoken men who called me keeper and apologized and ran their hands down my sleeves. They found an old man's handkerchief and a wooden toy worn smooth by some long-dead child's hand, and laughed, and one tossed it back and said the marsh boy might like a plaything to take home to his fens, and that, God help them, was exactly true and exactly enough. I will not tell you everything that passed in the boy's rooms. Some of it was Tobin's and is his to keep. I will tell you that I found a young man who had stopped looking people in the eye, that he turned the little soldier over in his hands and went very still when I said the words about the heron, and that something came up behind his face that had not been there a moment before, not hope exactly, but the memory of a man who had loved him. The old king had visited the marsh. It turned out, more than once in plain clothes, an old man playing at the water's edge with a half-forgotten grandnephew. On one of those visits he had given the boy a toy soldier, and told him it stood guard while he slept, and shown him, laughing, the worn ring with the bird on it that he wore under his shirt, and said it was their secret against all the clever people in the city. The boy looked up at me with the toy in his fist and said, he was real then. I had begun to think I made him up. And I knew, looking at him, that Edric Marl had been right about the one thing that mattered most, that the marsh boy was not unfit, and was not a coward, and was not small. He had only been alone, and told 1,000 times in 1,000 gentle ways that he was nothing, by people who needed him to believe it. The exact craft the dead king had foreseen, to erase a true heir not with a blade but with a steady patient dimming until he agreed to disappear on his own. I told him, word for word, what the sergeant had given me to say. The heart of it was this, that the truth of who he was did not depend on whether the lords believed it. It was a fact like the date or the weather, already sealed, already witnessed, carried 2 years against the heart of a man who had never once doubted it. That on the coronation day a moment would come, after the false oath and before the crown, when the archbishop by ancient form would ask the assembly whether any man knew just cause why the succession should not proceed. A relic no one had answered in living memory, and the one crack in the lie wide enough to drive the truth through, because they could not omit it without insulting 1,000 years, and could not control it once it was open. And that when the question was asked, he must stand and answer it, must not run, must not shake, must say the words we gave him and then say nothing more, because the rest would be carried by another man. His whole task was to stand up and not be afraid for the length of one sentence. "They will say I am a liar," the boy said, "or mad, or paid." "They have those names ready," I agreed, "but they have no name for the heron. No forger can. The man at the door will see to the heron. You have only to open the door for him." I left him that night turning the wooden soldier over and over in his hands, and I do not think he slept, and I know I did not. The danger now ran ahead of us like fire in dry grass. On the 6th day Carrick, the steward of the gray gloves, came to the rolls office and stood close behind me while I worked, and remarked, in his soft, pleasant voice, that he hoped I was not overtiring myself. An old man, alone in his rooms at night. He had heard I kept odd hours, because the kingdom would so hate to lose a keeper of my long service to some accident of the stairs. He smiled when he said it. I thanked him for his concern, and did not let my hand shake until he was gone. They did not yet know about the sergeant, or the second copy, or the boy and the toy soldier, but they knew the old keeper had begun to ask quiet questions, and men like Carrick do not leave a loose thread. I went that night to the gallery again, to warn the sergeant that the steward had marked me. He was not on the council door. For one cold, endless moment I thought they had reached him first, that the truth of the kingdom and the only man brave enough to carry it had both gone into the dark together, that I would be next, and Tobin after me, and the lie would close over all of us like water over a low field. I stood in the empty gallery before the empty door and felt the whole thing slipping, and I did not know that the absence of Edric Marle from his post, the first time in 30 years he had ever left it without orders, was not the end of everything. It was the beginning of the only part of this that the kingdom would ever see. He had left his post, but not run from it. He had gone where a man goes when he understands that the lie will be made law in 2 days inside a cathedral he himself is not permitted to enter, and that the truth he carries is worth nothing if it dies in a corridor before it can be spoken before the world. He had gone to make himself impossible to lose. I learned the whole of it only afterward, pieced from a dozen frightened mouths, so you can see how a man who could not raise his voice arranged to be heard by an entire kingdom. First, he had not kept the heron-sealed instrument against his heart any longer. He had understood, the moment Carrick threatened me, that the document was now the most dangerous object in Estmere. A single body could be made to disappear with it inside the coat. So on the 6th night before he ever left his post, he made 3 true copies of the king's instrument in his own plain soldier's hand, not forgeries, for there was nothing to forge, and swore out the account on each, that he had witnessed the late king's seal the true succession, and that the original bore beneath the great seal a second and secret mark, a heron, known to 4 men alone. The original he sealed into a plain leather wallet. The 3 sworn copies he sent by 3 different hands he had spent 30 silent years learning to trust, an old armorer, a laundrywoman whose son he had once kept out of trouble, a chaplain, with instructions that if he did not come for them by the coronation hour, they were to be read aloud in 3 public markets at once. A lie can be killed in a strong room. It cannot be killed in 3 markets at the same hour. Then and only then he had left his post, not to flee, but to do the one thing his whole life had trained him to do better than any man in the kingdom, to take up a position and hold it until the moment came. He could not enter the cathedral as a guardsman in the coronation party. Vel's people had hand-picked that detail themselves, and an unexplained sergeant would be turned at the door. So he did the only thing left. On the morning of the 7th day, he walked into the office of the captain of the cathedral watch, the ceremonial guard that lines the nave on coronation day, drawn by ancient right not from the palace household, but from the old city companies, stood before a captain who owed the old king's memory a debt, laid down the wallet, opened it, and let an honest soldier look at a heron hidden in wax for the length of time it takes an honest soldier to go pale. I do not know exactly what was said. I know the captain was a man named Osric who had served under the old king in the River War, and had wept openly at his bier, while the new court thought him sentimental. I know that when Edric Marle finished speaking, Osric did not run to the chancellor, because Edric had explained why that road ended in 2 empty boxes, And I know that the next morning the roster of the cathedral watch carried one name more than the day before, an old door sergeant transferred in, to make up the numbers. And that this caused not the slightest comment, because adding one more red coat to a line of red coats is the single most invisible thing that can happen in a palace. He had got himself into the cathedral, lawfully, in uniform, standing the wall. The 8th day came up cold and bright. I have stood in that cathedral for 4 coronations, and there has never been one like it, though to every eye but 4 it looked exactly as it should. The nave was full to the doors, and the doors open to the square. The lords sat in their ranks in furred robes, the envoys of 6 kingdoms sat in theirs, the choir stood in white. And down both long sides of the nave, between the people and the great men, stood the cathedral watch, 2 unbroken lines of red coats and tall hats and white gloves and grounded rifles, still as carved stone, every face forward, and one of those faces, halfway down the left-hand line near the place where the procession would pass to the altar, was a face I knew, and it did not so much as flicker when I came in, though I am certain he saw me, because Edric Marl saw everything. Lord Hadrian Vel came up the nave to be made King of Estmere, and he was magnificent. I will give the man that. He had waited 10 years and wore the waiting like a robe. He smiled at the lords and inclined his head to the envoys, and knelt at the altar with a grace the old king had never had, and the archbishop took up the forged proclamation and read it to the assembly. The king's last lucid hour, the setting aside of the unfit boy, the naming of Lord Vel, under the king's own hand and the great seal. The kingdom listened to the lie read out in a great cathedral by a holy man, and found it beautiful and true, because that is what lies are for. And the marsh boy was there. They had brought him, of course. It suited the story to have him present and seen to be content. He sat among the minor relations in a good plain coat, small and quiet, and I watched him and my heart failed me, because he looked exactly as he had always looked, lost and uncertain and beaten, and I thought, he will not do it. They have dimmed him too long. He will sit there and let it happen. The oath was administered. Lord Vel swore to defend the realm of Estmere and its people and its laws, and the irony of it did not move one muscle in 2 lines of guardsmen's faces. The archbishop turned to the altar to take up the crown. And then he turned back because the form required it, and lifted his old voice, and asked the question that no one in living memory had ever answered, the relic, the dead tradition, the crack in the lie too ancient to leave out. If any man here knows just cause or impediment why this succession should not proceed, let him stand now and speak, and be heard, or hereafter hold his peace forever. The silence that followed was the silence of 1,000 people who have heard the words 100 times and never once expected them to mean anything. It was a held breath, a formality, a half-second of nothing before the crown. Into that half-second, halfway down the left-hand line of the cathedral watch, one red coat moved. He did not shout. He did not break ranks and rush the altar. He did the smallest possible thing, the thing 30 years had made him. He came to attention, hard, both heels striking the cathedral floor together with a single crack that went up into the great stone vault like a shot. And in the ringing aftermath of that one sound, with every face in the kingdom turning toward it, Sergeant Edric Marl of the King's Door Guard turned his head and looked across the nave, directly at a small lost boy in a good plain coat, and the boy who had spent a lifetime being told he was nothing, and 2 years being dimmed toward agreeing, looked back at the only man besides a dead king who had ever told him otherwise. And Tobin stood up. He was shaking. I could see it from where I sat, the tremble in the plain coat, and for one terrible breath I thought it would shake the words out of him before he could find them. The whole cathedral had turned, 1,000 faces, the lords, the envoys, the archbishop with the crown in his 2 hands, Lord Vel kneeling at the altar with the smile not yet gone from his face, all staring at a small marsh-bred boy who had been told to be content and was, instead, on his feet. He said the words we had given him. He did not say them well. His voice cracked on the first of them and steadied on the last, and that crack did more for him than any orator's polish could have, because no one in that cathedral had ever heard a sound less like a paid man or a madman. "I know just cause," Tobin said. "I am Tobin, true grandson of King Aldis's brother of the blood, and the proclamation read here today is a forgery. The king my great-uncle named me his heir under his own hand in the Great Seal, 2 winters gone, and sealed it with a second mark beneath the seal that no forger living has ever seen. I knew the man who carried it. I know the mark." His voice did not crack on the last of it. "It is a heron. Ask the man who has it." And the cathedral came apart into noise, a roar. 1,000 voices at once, lords on their feet, the archbishop frozen with the crown above the kneeling man, and through it Lord Vell rising smooth and fast and turning to the assembly with his hands spread, and his face already arranged into patient sorrow, the look of a great man pained by a sad, confused boy, beginning in his beautiful, reasonable voice, the only thing the faction had left, to drown the truth in pity and procedure before it could be tested. "My lords, the poor child is unwell, he has been told these fancies. There is no second mark, there is no heron, there is only a forged proclamation. The lords have all seen the document." "The lords have seen a document," said a new voice, and it carried, because it was pitched to carry, a parade ground voice that had spent 30 years learning to cross a courtyard without ever being raised in anger. "They have not seen the kings." Edric Marl had stepped out of the line. He came down the nave with the leather wallet in his white-gloved hand, and the cathedral watch did not stop him, because the captain stood at the head of the line with his hand visibly off his hilt, and that is its own kind of order. The sergeant walked the length of that cathedral at a marching pace, unhurried into the middle of the roar, and the roar fell away ahead of him the way it does ahead of a man who plainly knows exactly what he is doing. He stopped below the altar steps. He did not kneel. He inclined his head to the archbishop, holy man to honest soldier, opened the wallet, and held up the parchment so the high windows fell on it. "I am Edric Marl, sergeant of the king's door guard," he said, and the cathedral heard every word. 2 winters passed. King Aldis called me into his cabinet at night and made me witness while he sealed the true succession in his own hand, naming this boy. He sealed it twice, the great seal you all know, and beneath it in the same wax, a private signet he wore against his skin, his own father's ring, a heron. He gave it into my keeping and told me to hold it against the day a lie was told. I have held it 2 years. Here it is. The great seal any clever man can steal." He turned the parchment in the light, and his blunt-gloved finger came to rest below the great red impression of the tower and the 3 rivers, on a second, smaller mark pressed into the same wax. "The heron, no man can. Bring the keeper of the rolls. Let him say before you all whether this seal is true, and whether any forgery in the kingdom carries the bird." 1,000 faces turned to me. I will tell you that my legs did not want to lift me, and that I thought of Carrick and the stairs, and the accident the kingdom would so hate, and that I stood up anyway, because a frightened old clerk had finally been handed the one thing he had lacked all along, which was not courage but company. A man does not have to be brave to tell the truth standing next to Edric Marl. He only has to be honest, and let the brave man hold the line. I came down to the altar steps and took the parchment in my hands, and I have never in 31 years been so glad of 40,000 seals. I knew the wax at a touch, true wax, pressed once, never warmed and worked, the matrix bite clean and deep. And there beneath the tower was the heron, small and worn and unmistakable, an old ring's mark fused under the great seal. A thing that could not be added after and could not be removed and could not, by any art known to any forger in Estmere, have been put there by anyone but a man who held the ring. "This seal is true," I said, and my voice did not crack because the sergeants had not. Pressed once in one wax, both marks together, which can only be done at the moment of sealing by the man who holds both seals, the great seal and the king's own heron. I drew this instrument myself, that winter night in the king's cabinet and witnessed him seal it. I lifted my paper of the dark gray thread and laid the whole forgery open before the lords, the warmed wax, the doubled impression, the lifted and replaced seal of the empty box that the law swore could not be emptied, the matter of who wore gray kid gloves, and named in front of 6 kingdoms the work of the patient hand. The proclamation read to you today bears the great seal lifted with a hot wire and pressed twice. It carries no heron. It cannot, because the men who made it did not know the heron exists. They forged the king's hand and they stole the king's seal. They could not steal the one thing the king kept secret for exactly this hour. There was no roar after that. There was the other thing, the worst thing for a man like Vel, the silence of a great room rearranging what it believes. I watched it cross the faces of the lords one by one, the slow, cold turning, and watched it reach Lord Hadrian Vel, who had waited 10 years and arranged everything and forgotten only to count the man on the door, and understand that there was no beautiful, reasonable sentence left in the world that could put the heron back into the dark. The rest the law did, and did quickly, because nothing makes lords decisive like the discovery that they were very nearly made fools of in front of foreign envoys. Carrick of the Grey Gloves was taken before the day was out, and he did what soft men do when the powerful man above them goes down. He talked at length to save himself, and the whole patient architecture of the thing came out. The hot wire, the night the box was robbed, the man inside the Rolls office paid to look away. Lord Vel was not crowned. He was escorted from the cathedral he had filled for his own crowning, stripped of his offices and his lands, and sent to live out his clever life on a far estate where there was no one left worth being clever for. And the boy was crowned. Not that day. The law and the lords wanted the forgery fully unmade first, the true instrument lodged and proclaimed, and the realm told the whole of it plainly, which took a fortnight. But on a bright morning 2 weeks on, in the same cathedral, under the same tower and 3 rivers, Tobin of Estmere, true grandson of the old king's brother, knelt where the pretender had knelt and was made king in truth, by his own right in front of the world. He did not shake. Whatever the dimming had taken out of him over 2 long years, one cracked sentence in front of 1,000 people had begun to give back, and a man who has stood up once in the worst room of his life knows for the rest of it that he can. I was there, of course. I held the true instrument while it was read, and this time the reading was the reading of a fact, and the heron in the wax was shown to the lords and they bared their heads to it. And I looked as the crown came down, for the one man who had made all of it possible, and I found him exactly where I knew he would be, back on the wall, halfway down the left-hand line, in the place a guardsman stands, face forward, eyes on nothing, as still as if he had never in his life done anything but stand still. The new king looked for him too. I saw it, the smallest turn of the crowned head, the search down the line of red coats, the finding, and the long quiet look that passed between a young man who had been told he was nothing and the old sergeant who had carried the proof against his heart for 2 years and never said a word. The king did not call him forward. He understood, even crowned, that you do not call such a man out of the line. The line is where his honor lives. He only let the look stand for the both of them, and then turned back to his realm. Afterward, when the cathedral had emptied and the long day was done, I went to him on the wall and asked the thing I had wanted to ask for 2 years. Why he had waited. Why, on the morning the forged proclamation was read in council, with the truth folded inside his coat, he had not simply stepped forward and ended it then and there and spared us all the rest. He was a long time answering, the way he was always a long time answering, and when he did not turn his head, and his eyes did not leave the empty nave. A guard does not decide the kingdom, he said. That is not his to do, and a man who starts deciding it stops being a guard and becomes only another man with a paper and an opinion, and there are enough of those. The king gave me a thing to keep and a day to keep it for, until an honest man did the honest thing with a lie. My part was to be standing there, with the truth still safe, on the day the honest thing could be done in the open where it would hold. The clerk found his honesty. The boy found his feet. The captain remembered his king. I only kept the door long enough for all of them to walk through it. He was quiet a moment, and then he said the only thing I ever heard him say that came near to pride, and it was not pride in himself. "They counted me as furniture," he said. "For 2 years, every man in this palace who meant the kingdom harm walked past me and never once lowered his voice, because a thing that does not move is a thing that does not matter. That is the whole secret of the doorkeeper. The kingdom is not always saved by the men who are seen to save it. Sometimes it is saved by the one they forgot was even a man, because he was still there, and still awake, and still keeping the thing he was told to keep, on the day it finally mattered that someone had. He never took the reward the king offered him: rank, land, a place at the table. He asked only to be returned to the king's own door, and stood it until he was too old, and a few years past that, because no one could imagine the door without him. And when at last he could not stand it any longer, the king who owed him a crown went to him and sat with him, and that is between the two of them. I am an old man now, older than he was that winter night, and I have spent my life among seals, learning that the truest mark is the one a forger does not know to copy. A kingdom is the same. The loud men make the proclamations, the clever men forge them, the great cathedral fills, and the world watches the crown come down and believes it has seen where the power was. But the power was never there. It was halfway down the left-hand line, face forward, eyes on nothing, in a man too still to be counted, keeping the door against his heart until an honest morning came. That is the seal beneath the seal. That is the heron in the wax. And I have learned to look, ever after, not at the throne, but at the quiet red coats no one is watching, because that is where the kingdom is really kept.